In the dust-choked heart of the West, where justice was sold to the highest bidder, a pregnant widow committed an act no one saw coming. Before the entire town, she stared down the most powerful man in the territory, a man who dealt in ruin and fear. For $1, she bought a broken cowboy and his terrified son off the auction block, an act of charity that looked like madness. But she wasn't just buying a life, she was buying a secret that would unravel a web of deceit, expose a killer, and ignite a fire that stunned the whole town. The sun over Redemption Gulch was a merciless hammer, beating down on the cracked earth and the bowed heads of its citizens. It was a heat that baked the hope out of a man, leaving behind only the dry dust of survival. Clara Mae Thompson felt it deep in her bones, an oppressive weight that added to the one she already carried low in her belly. 6 months a widow, 7 months with child, she stood in the shadow of the general store, her hand resting on the swell of her stomach, as if to shield her unborn baby from the ugliness of the day. The town was gathered for an auction, but not for cattle or land. Today, they were auctioning off the debt of a man. It was a cruel spectacle, orchestrated by Bartholomew "Bart" Pullman, the owner of the sprawling Pullman Cattle Company, and for all intents and purposes, the owner of Redemption Gulch itself. Pullman was a man carved from granite and greed, with eyes the color of a winter sky, and a smile that never reached them. He stood on the steps of the saloon, a gold watch chain glinting against his brocade vest, overseeing the proceedings like a king surveying his dreary court. The auctioneer, a nervous man named Beasley, whose Adam's apple bobbed with every word, cleared his throat. "All right, folks, by the authority of the territorial court, we offer the labor contract of one Silas Cole to settle a debt of $200 to the Pullman Cattle Company." 2 men dragged Silas forward and shoved him onto a wooden crate. The sight stole the breath from Clara's lungs. He was a wreck of a man, his face a swollen, purpled mess of cuts and bruises. One eye was sealed shut. His shirt was torn and stained with blood, clinging to a frame that was all sharp angles and trembling muscle. He was tall, but he stood hunched, his hands bound in front of him, his spirit so thoroughly beaten it seemed a miracle he was standing at all. Huddled behind him, clutching his father's torn trousers, was a small boy of about 7. His hair was the color of corn silk, matted with dust, and his face was a pale, tear-streaked mask of terror. He didn't make a sound, but his wide, haunted eyes darted across the crowd, seeing not people, but monsters.
1 year of hard labor.
"Do I have an opening bid?" A sick silence fell over the crowd. This wasn't justice. It was a public lynching of a man's dignity. Everyone knew the story was a lie. Silas Cole had been one of Pullman's best ranch hands, a quiet but fiercely competent man. The whispers said he'd found out something he shouldn't have, something about Pullman's business practices. This auction wasn't about a broken fence. It was a warning to everyone else. "This is what happens when you cross me." "A fine worker when he's not clumsy," Pullman boomed, his voice dripping with false magnanimity. "Strong back, just needs a firm hand. Surely someone can use a hand for a year. Shall we start the bidding at, say, $50? More silence. The townsfolk shuffled their feet, their eyes fixed on the ground, on the rooftops, anywhere but on the broken man on the crate or the terrifying child behind him. They were good people mostly, but their courage was a currency they couldn't afford to spend against Bart Pullman. Clara felt a surge of something hot and fierce in her chest. It was the same righteous anger her late husband Frank had possessed. Frank would have stepped forward. He would have spoken up. But Frank was gone, killed in a riding accident out on the range 4 months ago, leaving Clara with a small, struggling ranch and a future that felt as barren as the land around her. She looked at Silas Cole, at the one good eye that stared blankly ahead, devoid of light. Then she looked at the boy, Cody, who was trying to be invisible, to shrink into nothingness. In his terrified eyes, she saw the reflection of her own fears, of being alone, of being helpless in a world run by men like Pullman. Her hand tightened on her belly. The child within her kicked, a small, insistent flutter of life. It was as if the baby itself was urging her on, reminding her that passivity was a luxury she no longer had. $1. The voice was quiet, but it cut through the oppressive silence like a blade. Heads snapped around. Bart Pullman's smirk faltered. The auctioneer's jaw dropped. Clara Mae Thompson stepped out of the shadows. Her plain calico dress was dusty, her face pale with determination, but her eyes, the color of warm honey, were clear and steady. She met Pullman's gaze without flinching. "What was that, Mrs. Thompson?" Pullman asked, his voice now laced with a dangerous silkiness. "My bid is $1, she repeated, her voice stronger this time. She took a step forward, into the full, punishing glare of the sun. The crowd parted for her, as if she were a ghost. A few titters ran through the onlookers. $1? It was an insult. It was absurd. Pullman's eyes narrowed into slits. He saw this for what it was. Not a bid, but a defiance. The auctioneer asked for an opening bid. He did not specify a minimum, Clara stated. Her knowledge of the law, however small, gleaned from her father who had been a clerk. "I have bid $1. Do I hear another?" She looked directly at Beasley, the auctioneer, whose face was now slick with sweat. Beasley looked desperately at Pullman. The cattle baron gave a nearly imperceptible shake of his head. He wanted to humiliate Silas, to make an example of him. He had expected the other ranchers, his cronies, to bid to own a piece of Cole's shame. But Clara's intervention had changed the air. Her sheer, unexpected audacity had shamed the other potential bidders into silence. To bid now would be to publicly align with Pullman against a grieving, pregnant widow. Do I hear 51? Beasley squeaked, looking around at the silent faces. No one moved, no one spoke. The only sound was the wind, whistling a lonely tune through the eaves of the buildings. Going once? Beasley's voice trembled. Pullman's face was a mask of thunder. He could, of course, buy the debt himself. But that would be an admission of defeat, a retreat from a public challenge. His power was rooted in the perception of untouchability. A pregnant woman could not be allowed to chip away at that foundation. Yet, the trap was set. Going twice. Clara's heart pounded against her ribs. She hadn't thought this far ahead. What in God's name was she doing? She could barely manage her own ranch. How could she take on 2 more mouths to feed, one of them a broken man who looked one step from the grave? Sold! Beasley slammed his gavel down on the saloon railing with a crack that made everyone jump. To Mrs. Clara Mae Thompson for the sum of $1. A collective stunned exhale swept through the crowd. But Bart Pullman's face was livid. He took a step forward, his hand clenching into a fist, but his lawyer, a weasel-faced man named Cowboy, put a restraining hand on his arm and whispered something in his ear. Pullman stopped, his chest heaving. He shot Clara a look of pure venom, a look that promised retribution. Then, without another word, he turned on his heel and stormed into the saloon, his men following in his wake. The tension broke. The crowd began to murmur and disperse, casting furtive, bewildered glances at Clara. She was left standing alone in the dusty street, the new owner of a man's life. She walked slowly toward the crate. As she approached, Silas Cole finally looked at her. His one good eye was filled with a bottomless well of shame and confusion. He tried to stand, to say something, but he swayed on his feet. Clara ignored him for a moment and knelt, wincing at the strain on her back. She looked at the little boy, Cody.
She reached into the pocket of her dress
And pulled out a small, sharp penknife. She didn't offer it to Silas. Instead, she held it out, handle first, to the boy. "Can you help me? I need you to cut the ropes on your papa's hands. You have to be very careful." For the first time, a flicker of something other than fear crossed the boy's face. He looked at the knife, then up at his father, then back to Clara. Slowly, hesitantly, he reached out and took it. His small, trembling fingers worked at the thick rope, sawing back and forth with fierce concentration. After a moment, the rope fell away. Silas rubbed his raw wrists, his gaze fixed on Clara. He couldn't understand. "Why?" he rasped, his voice raw from disuse and pain. Clara got to her feet, her hand instinctively going to her back. "Because my late husband always said the only thing worse than a man in chains is the people who watch and do nothing." She looked from the beaten father to the terrified son. "I have a wagon down the street. My ranch isn't much, but there's a roof and there's water. Can you walk?" Silas nodded, a slow, pained movement. He placed a hand on his son's shoulder, a gesture of both protection and dependence. Together, the three of them, the pregnant widow, the broken cowboy, and his silent son, turned their backs on Redemption Gulch and began the slow walk toward a future that had just been irrevocably and dangerously rewritten. The whole town had been stunned, but for Clara, Silas, and Cody, the true shock was only just beginning. The journey to Clara's ranch was a slow, agonizing crawl. Her small spread, the double H, which had stood for Frank and Clara Hayes before she'd taken back her maiden name of Thompson, was nestled 3 miles north of town in a small valley cut by a shallow creek. To Clara, it had always felt like a sanctuary. Today, with Silas stumbling beside the wagon and little Cody perched silently on the seat next to her, it felt like an island of staggering responsibility in a sea of trouble. Silas refused to ride in the wagon, a point of pride Clara didn't have the heart to argue with. Every step was a visible effort, his body a testament to the brutality he'd endured. He didn't speak a word the entire way, his focus narrowed to the simple, torturous act of putting one foot in front of the other. When they finally arrived, the sun was beginning to dip below the western mesas, painting the sky in bruised shades of orange and purple. The ranch was modest, a small, sturdy-looking cabin Frank had built with his own hands, a weathered barn, a chicken coop, and a few corrals, all enclosed by a simple post and rail fence.
Silas finally looked up,
Taking in the small homestead. His one good eye scanned the property, lingering on the neat woodpile, the tidy porch, the single rocking chair that sat empty. It was a place of peace, a stark contrast to the living hell he'd just escaped. The shame returned, hot and heavy. "Ma'am," he began, his voice cracking, we can't impose." "You're not imposing," Clara cut him off, her tone firm but not unkind. "I bought your labor for a year. That means I'm responsible for your board. Now, get some rest. You're no good to me half dead." She turned and walked toward the cabin without waiting for a reply, the finality of her words leaving no room for argument. Inside, the cabin was sparse but immaculate. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and a simple wooden table and 2 chairs sat in the center of the room. She moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a woman who knew her own home and her own mind. She ladled a thick beef stew into 2 tin plates and cut thick slices of bread. When she carried the food out to the barn, she found Silas sitting against the wall of the stall, his eyes closed in exhaustion. Cody was curled up in the hay beside him, already fast asleep, his small chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. He looked like an angel who had fallen into a nightmare. Clara set the plates down quietly. "He should be in a proper bed," she murmured. "He wouldn't leave my side," Silas said without opening his eyes. He's seen too much." "And you?" she asked softly. He finally opened his eye, and the depth of the pain in it made her ache. "I'm where I deserve to be." "No one deserves what Pullman did to you," she said fiercely. A bitter, humorless sound escaped his throat. "You don't know anything about it, ma'am." "Then tell me." He fell silent, his jaw tightening. The silence stretched, filled only by the chirping of crickets and the soft rustle of the hay. "It's better you don't know," he said at last. "You've done a kind thing today, Mrs. Thompson, a foolish, dangerous thing, but a kind one. The best way you can help us now is to let us move on in a day or two. We'll be out of your hair. Pullman will forget about you." "I paid $1 for you, Mr. Cole," Clara said, her voice hardening slightly. "I expect to get my dollar's worth. You'll work it off. When you can stand without swaying, you can start by mending the fence on the north pasture." She left him with his food and his silence, walking back to her lonely cabin under a blanket of stars. Sleep did not come easily. She lay in her bed, feeling the life inside her and thinking of the 2 broken lives sleeping in her barn. She had acted on pure, unthinking instinct, a rebellion against the cruel. The next few days settled into a tense, unspoken routine. Clara would leave food and a bucket of hot water outside the barn at dawn. Silas, after tending to his own gruesome injuries with salt water and clean rags she provided, would set to work. He was as good as his reputation suggested. Despite his pain, he moved with an economy of motion that spoke of years of hard work. He relatched the corral gate, reshod Clara's mare, and began the long, arduous task of mending the north fence. He worked from sunup to sundown, pushing his body to its limits as if trying to punish it further. Cody remained his father's silent shadow. He'd follow Silas around the ranch, carrying tools that were too heavy for him, his eyes wide and watchful. He never spoke, not a single word. He communicated with his father through a series of subtle glances and gestures that Clara couldn't decipher. When Clara tried to speak to him, offering him a piece of cornbread or a cup of milk, he would flinch and hide behind his father. The boy's silence was a wall she couldn't seem to breach. One afternoon, she found him by the chicken coop, staring intently at the hens. She approached slowly, holding out a handful of feed. "They like this," she said gently. "Would you like to give it to them?" Cody looked at the feed, then at her, his expression unreadable. He gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of his head and scurried back toward the barn, where Silas was splitting firewood, the rhythmic thwack of the axe, a constant, reassuring sound. Clara sighed, her heart heavy. The boy was like a terrified colt, and she had no idea how to gentle him. The first sign of trouble came a week after the auction. Clara was returning from the creek, a bucket of water in each hand, when she saw 2 riders cresting the hill. They weren't neighbors, they were Pullman's men. Her stomach clenched. She set the buckets down, her hand going to her belly. The men, a burly, bearded man named Jeb and a younger, sneering cowboy named Riley, trotted their horses right up to her porch and dismounted without invitation. From the barn, the sound of the axe fell silent. "Afternoon, Mrs. Thompson," Jeb said, his eyes roaming over her, lingering on her pregnant stomach in a way that made her skin crawl. "Mr. Pullman was just concerned. Wanted us to check on you, make sure you're managing all right out here, all alone." "I'm not alone," Clara said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I have Mr. Cole, as you well know." "Ah, yes, the charity case," Riley sneered. "How's that working out? Hasn't fallen on his face and broken anything else of yours yet?" Just then, Silas emerged from the barn, holding the axe. He wasn't menacing. "Look, ma'am, Mr. Pullman is a reasonable man. He recognizes you acted out of, well, female sentiment. He's willing to be generous. He'll buy Cole's debt off you. $10. You make a handsome profit, and this problem is off your hands." "He's not a problem," Clara said, "and he's not for sale." Riley chuckled. "Playing rancher is a tough game, ma'am. Fences break, wells run dry, sometimes cattle just wander off. Be a shame if a woman in your condition had to deal with any more misfortune." The threat hung in the air, as thick and foul as smoke. It wasn't just about Silas anymore. It was about her land, her home, her future. Clara lifted her chin. "Is that a threat, Mr. Riley?" "Just an observation about the hardships of this life." Jeb cut in smoothly, giving Riley a warning look. "Think about the offer, Mrs. Thompson. It's a neighborly gesture." They mounted their horses and rode off, leaving a cloud of dust and a palpable sense of dread behind them. That evening, a storm rolled in, mirroring the turmoil in Clara's heart. Rain lashed against the cabin, and thunder cracked overhead. She sat at her table, staring into the flames of the fireplace, when a soft knock came at the door. She opened it to find Silas standing on her porch, soaked to the bone, with Cody huddled behind him. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low, "you need to take Pullman's offer. Get inside, both of you, before you catch your death," she ordered, stepping aside. They hesitated, then shuffled into the warmth of the cabin, dripping water onto the wooden floor. Cody's eyes were wide as he took in the room, the fire, the relative comfort. "I heard what they said," Silas continued, water running in rivulets from his hair. "This is my fight. I won't have you or your boy brought into it." "My boy," Clara said, a faint, wry smile touching her lips as she placed a hand on her belly. "I suppose you're right. And it became my fight the moment I made my bid. They threatened my home, Mr. Cole, my land, the only thing I have left of my husband." He looked at her, truly looked at her, and for the first time, she saw past the pain and the shame with a man beneath. She saw integrity. "Pullman won't stop," he said quietly. "He'll ruin you. For sport." "Why?" she asked, her voice pleading. "Why does he hate you so much? What did you find out?" Silas stared into the fire, the flames dancing in his good eye. He was silent for a long time, the war within him plain on his battered face. Cody, sensing the shift in mood, crept closer to his father and slipped a small hand into his. Finally, Silas spoke, his voice barely a whisper. The word landed with a dead final weight. Clara sank into a chair, her mind reeling. She had known Bart Pullman was ruthless, but this was a different, darker evil. "Tell me," she said, her voice a near whisper. "Tell me everything." And so, with the storm raging outside and little Cody finally succumbing to the warmth and dozing by the hearth, Silas Cole told his story. He spoke in a low, even tone, as if the events were too monstrous for emotional inflection. He'd worked for Pullman for 5 years, rising to the position of foreman. Pullman valued his efficiency and his quiet nature. But Silas wasn't blind. He started noticing things that didn't add up. "He has a system," Silas explained, his gaze fixed on the fire. "He targets the smaller ranches, the ones on the edge of his territory, the ones with good water access. He'll have his men, Jeb and Riley are his favorites, drive a few head of Pullman cattle onto the neighbor's property at night. They cut a fence to make it look like they strayed." Clara nodded, picturing it. Go on. A week later, Pullman himself rides out with the sheriff, a man named Potter, who's so deep in Pullman's pocket he's practically lint. They ride onto the poor fellow's land on the pretense of looking for lost cattle. And what do you know? They find them. Pullman cattle with the big P brand, clear as day. And he accuses the rancher of rustling, Clara breathed, the pieces clicking into place. Worse, Silas said, a muscle twitching in his jaw. He offers a choice. The rancher can face a charge of cattle rustling, a hanging offense, or he can sell his land to Pullman to settle the matter quietly. He offers pennies on the dollar. Faced with the gallows, what's a man to do? They always sell. He's swallowed up 4 ranches that way in the last 2 years. The Abernathy place, the Miller homestead. It was a brilliant, diabolical scheme. It used the law as a weapon and turned a man's own property into a trap. But how did you get involved? Clara asked. And the beating? I found the proof, Silas said grimly. Pullman's clever. He alters the brands on the cattle he uses for the scheme. He has a second, smaller iron. A circle he adds around his P brand. It's his private mark for the bait cattle. He keeps a ledger in his office, a little black book. In it he records the transactions, the dates, the names of the ranchers he's ruined, and a tally of the cattle with the marked brand. I saw it one night when he sent me to fetch some papers. He'd left it open on his desk. The foolhardy courage of a desperate man had taken hold of him. I confronted him, Silas admitted, his voice thick with regret. Told him I knew. I told him I was quitting, taking my boy and leaving the territory. The next thing I knew, Jeb and Riley were on me. They beat me in front of my own son. They locked us in a shed for 3 days before that auction. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. It wasn't just about silencing him. It was about destroying him, making him a public spectacle of Pullman's power. Clara felt a wave of nausea that had nothing to do with her pregnancy. She thought of the other ranchers, men she knew. Old man Abernathy, who had supposedly retired and moved back east. The Millers, a young couple who had vanished overnight, their dreams turned to dust. You said he was a killer, she prompted gently. Silas's face darkened. The first one he targeted was a man named Frank Hayes. Clara's blood ran cold. The room seemed to tilt on its axis. What did you say? Frank Hayes, Silas repeated, unaware of the bomb he had just detonated. It was before my time as foreman, but the story is legend among Pullman's inner circle. Hayes was stubborn. He was the only one who refused to sell. He knew it was a setup, and he called Pullman a thief to his face. He said he'd fight it in court. A week later, Hayes was found dead out on the range. His horse had supposedly stumbled in a prairie dog hole, thrown him, and broken his neck. The sheriff ruled it an accident. Clara couldn't breathe. Frank. Her Frank. A riding accident, they had told her. A tragic, senseless accident. She remembered the day Sheriff Potter had come to the door, his hat in his hands, his eyes refusing to meet hers. He'd been so quick to close the matter, so eager to assure her there was no foul play. But it wasn't an accident, was it? She whispered, the words like shards of glass in her throat. Silas finally looked at her, truly seeing the ghastly pale of her face, the horror dawning in her eyes. Understanding crashed down on him with the force of a physical blow. Hayes, Frank Hayes was your husband? Clara could only nod, a single jerky movement. The grief she had been bottling up for months, the polite, dignified grief of a widow, shattered. In its place rose a cold, terrible rage. Her husband hadn't just died. He had been murdered for his land, for his integrity, and Bart Pullman had gotten away with it, smiling his cold smile while she mourned. The fight was no longer about a dollar, or a debt, or even a threat. It was about justice. It was about vengeance. That ledger, she said, her voice trembling with fury. "The one you saw. Does it have my husband's name in it?" "I don't know," Silas admitted. "I only saw the last page. But if his was the first ranch—" "We have to get it," she declared, her eyes blazing. "We have to get that book." Silas stared at her.
"And what is this?"
She shot back, her gesture taking in the cabin, the ranch, their precarious existence. Waiting for him to pick us off one by one? For him to burn my barn or poison my well? For him to take everything from me the way he took my husband? No, I will not live in fear, not anymore. Her passion was a force of nature, as wild as the storm outside. It swept away his caution, his shame. For the first time since the beating, a spark of the old Silas Cole returned to his eye, a flicker of defiance. He looked at this pregnant woman who had every reason to be afraid, and saw a courage that shamed his own despair. Slowly, he nodded. "There is one possibility," he said, thinking aloud. "Pullman hosts a poker game for his cronies every third Saturday. The sheriff, Calloway his lawyer, a few other ranchers, they drink heavily. The house staff is usually dismissed early. The game is in the parlor, on the ground floor. His office is on the second floor, at the back of the house." "When is the next game?" Clara asked, her heart hammering. Silas counted the days in his head. This Saturday. 4 days. It was insane. It was impossible. It was their only chance. The alliance in the small cabin was no longer uneasy. It was forged in shared loss and hardened by a common purpose. Over the next few days, a profound change occurred. The unspoken tension between them evaporated, replaced by the quiet intensity of co-conspirators. Silas began to heal in spirit as well as body. The purpose of their mission gave him a focus beyond his own pain. He sketched the layout of Pullman's ranch house in the dirt with a stick, marking windows, doors, and the patrol routes of the 2 guards, who always remained on duty. Clara, in turn, began to see beyond the victim she had rescued. She saw a smart, capable man. She watched him with Cody, saw the infinite tenderness in his rough hands as he bandaged a scrape on the boy's knee, and the fierce love in his eyes as they shared a silent joke. Even Cody began to thaw. One afternoon, Clara was hanging laundry when she started humming a lullaby, a simple tune her mother used to sing. She wasn't paying much attention until she realized a second, tiny voice had joined hers, humming slightly off-key. She turned. Cody was standing a few feet away, watching her, a shy, tentative smile on his face. It was the first time she had seen him smile. Her heart swelled. That evening, as they finalized their desperate plan, Cody sat at the table with them. He took a charred stick from the kindling box and, on a piece of scrap wood, he drew a picture. It was a crude drawing of 3 figures. A tall man, a woman with a big round belly, and a small boy.
"We do this for Frank,"
Clara whispered, her hand resting on the drawing. Silas looked at her, then at his son, who was watching them with an unnerving adult solemnity. "For Frank," he agreed, "and for Cody." They had 4 days to prepare for an impossible heist, to steal the one thing that could either save them or get them all killed. The storm outside had passed, but the one they were about to unleash on Bart Pullman was just beginning to gather. The days leading up to Saturday were fraught with a taut, nervous energy. Every creak of the cabin floor, every distant coyote howl sent a jolt of anxiety through Clara. The plan they had conceived was so audacious, so ridiculously dangerous, that it felt like a dream, a nightmare, from which she expected to be violently awakened at any moment. Silas was their strategist. Using his intimate knowledge of the Pullman ranch, he laid out the infiltration and escape. "The poker game starts at 8, he explained, pointing to his dirt-drawn map. By 10, they'll be deep in their whiskey. The two guards, Hank and Leo, are lazy. Hank patrols the front of the house, Leo the back. They switch every hour on the hour. The weak point is the 10-minute window during their switch. Hank goes to the bunkhouse to refill their flask, and Leo cuts through the stables. For those 10 minutes, the back of the house is blind. The office window, Clara recalled from his description. Exactly, Silas confirmed. It has a latch, but it's old. A good shove should open it. The problem isn't getting in. It's getting in and out, without being seen on the approach or the retreat. Their ranch was 3 miles away. A wagon was too slow and too loud. A single horse was faster, but still risky. The solution came from an unlikely source. Cody, who had been listening intently, tugged on his father's sleeve. He pointed toward the creek that ran through Clara's property, then made a winding motion with his finger. Silas frowned for a moment, then his eyes lit up with understanding. The creek bed, of course. The creek flowed from the hills behind Clara's ranch and passed less than 100 yards from the back of Pullman's property, concealed by a thicket of cottonwoods and brush. It was a natural, hidden trench. "The boy is a genius," Silas declared, ruffling Cody's hair. Cody beamed, his chest puffing out with pride. The plan was set. Silas would go. Clara, in her condition, could not risk the physical exertion. She would wait, a lonely sentinel, keeping a lamp burning in the window. "I don't like it," she said on Friday night, her voice tight with worry. "If you're caught—" "I won't be," Silas said, with a confidence he didn't entirely feel. He was doing this for her Frank, as much.
Clara was in the barn,
Milking her lone cow, when Sheriff Potter rode up. He wasn't accompanied by Pullman's thugs this time. He came alone, which was somehow more menacing. He was a man whose spinelessness had curdled into a kind of weary menace. "Afternoon, Clara," he said, not dismounting. He had known her since she was a girl. He had been friends with her father. "Sheriff," she replied coolly, continuing her work. "I'm here on an official matter," he said, pulling a folded paper from his saddlebag. "It's a notice of lien, from Mr. Pullman." Clara's hands stilled. "A lien? For what?" "According to this," Potter said, refusing to meet her eyes, "your late husband had an outstanding loan from Mr. Pullman for $200 for seed and equipment. With interest, the amount due is now $250. Mr. Pullman requires payment within 7 days, or he will be forced to begin foreclosure proceedings on this property." Clara shot to her feet, her face white with shock and fury. "That's a lie. Frank never borrowed a cent from that man. He hated him. We paid for our seed in cash at the general store." "I'm sorry, Clara. Mr. Pullman has a promissory note, signed by Frank." "It's a forgery," she cried. "Pullman is a snake and a liar, and you, Henry Potter, are a coward for doing his bidding." The sheriff flinched as if struck. "This ain't my doing. I'm just delivering the notice. You have 7 days." He wheeled his horse around and galloped away, eager to escape her righteous fury. Clara stood trembling, the fraudulent notice clutched in her hand. It was Pullman's countermove, his way of tightening the noose. He was trying to crush her spirit, to force her to sell not just Silas's debt, but her own home. He was doing to her exactly what he had done to her husband. When Silas found her, she was sitting on the porch, the paper lying on the floorboards beside her, her face a mask of despair. He picked up the notice and read it. His jaw hardened into a line of granite. "He's not just squeezing us," Silas said, grimly. "He's telling us he knows we're up to something. This is a warning shot." "It feels more like a cannonball," Clara whispered. 7 days? What can we do?" "We stick to the plan," Silas said, his voice resolute. He knelt in front of her. "We do this tonight. We get that ledger, that book is our only weapon. It's the only thing that can save this ranch. It's the only way to get justice for Frank." His strength bolstered hers. She looked into his one good eye and saw not a broken victim, but a warrior. She nodded. "Tonight." As dusk fell, the air grew thick with anticipation. Clara prepared a small satchel for Silas, containing a flask of water, a heel of bread.
You stay here with Mrs. Thompson, he whispered.
"You be brave for me. You hear?" Cody nodded, his lower lip trembling. He clung to his father's neck for a long moment before letting go. Silas stood and faced Clara. The space between them crackled with unspoken emotions. In the span of 2 weeks, they had gone from strangers to co-conspirators, their lives now inextricably linked. "Be careful, Silas," she said, her voice thick. "I will," he promised, and then he slipped out of the cabin and vanished into the darkness of the creek bed, a silent wraith on the most important mission of his life. The hours that followed were the longest of Clara's life. She and Cody sat at the table, the drawing the boy had made lying between them. She tried to read, but the words blurred on the page. She tried to sew, but her hands trembled too much. Every gust of wind sounded like hoofbeats. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Cody, sensing her fear, reached across the table and placed his small hand on hers. It was a simple gesture of comfort, of solidarity. Clara squeezed his hand, drawing strength from the small boy. Meanwhile, Silas moved through the darkness with the skill of a predator. The creek bed provided perfect cover, its gurgling water masking the sound of his footsteps. He reached the thicket of cottonwoods bordering Pullman's property and waited, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. The Pullman house was ablaze with light. He could hear the faint sound of laughter and shouting from the parlor. The poker game was in full swing. He checked the time on the old pocket watch Frank had left her, which she had insisted he take. It was 9:55. Time to move. He crept from the cover of the trees, moving low and fast across the open ground to the back of the house. He pressed himself against the stone foundation, directly beneath the dark square of the office window. He could hear the guards' voices as they met near the stables for their switch. This was his chance. He reached up, his fingers finding the bottom of the window sash. It was stiff. He pushed. It didn't budge. Panic, cold and sharp, pricked at him. He took a deep breath, braced his feet, and shoved with all his might. The old wood groaned in protest, and then, with a sharp crack, the latch gave way. The window slid open. Without a second's hesitation, he hoisted himself up and through the opening, tumbling silently onto the thick Persian rug inside. He was in. The office was just as he remembered it, opulent and suffocating. A massive mahogany desk dominated the room, and the walls were lined with books that Silas suspected had never been read. The air smelled of leather, cigar smoke, and power. He moved quickly to the desk. His eyes fell upon a framed photograph on the desk. It was of a severe-looking woman with Pullman's cold eyes, his late wife. On a hunch, Silas picked it up. He felt a slight ridge on the back. He pried the backing off. Taped to the inside was a small, ornate brass key. His hands shaking slightly, he unlocked the center drawer of the desk. He slid it open, and there it was, a small, black, leather-bound ledger. His heart leaped. He grabbed it, tucking it securely inside his shirt. He was turning to leave when his eye caught something else in the drawer, a second, smaller ledger, almost a diary, bound in red leather. Curiosity, or perhaps fate, made him pick it up. He flipped it open to a random page. Pullman's spidery handwriting filled the page. October 14. Hayes continues to be a problem. Arrogant fool, refuses my generous offer. Spouts nonsense about the law. He will learn that I am the law in this valley. A permanent solution will be required. An accident on the North Range, perhaps. Potter has agreed to be cooperative. Silas felt the blood drain from his face. This wasn't just a record of theft. It was a confession to murder. This book was even more valuable than the black one. He snatched it too. He had what he came for. It was time to go. He moved back to the window, but as he was about to climb out, he heard voices from the hallway. Getting another bottle from the cellar. A slurred voice. Calloway, the lawyer, said, "Don't be long," Pullman's voice replied, much closer than Silas had expected. "I'm on a winning streak." Pullman selected a cigar, clipped the end with a silver cutter, and turned to leave. His eyes, however, did a cursory sweep of the room, the habitual scan of a man who trusts no one. For a heart-stopping second, his gaze lingered on the window. Silas was certain he'd noticed the broken latch, the slight draft. But Pullman, his mind clouded by whiskey and cards, merely grunted and walked out, closing the door behind him. Silas waited a full minute, his muscles screaming with tension before he dared to move. He slipped from behind the curtain, slid out the window, and dropped silently to the ground below. He didn't run. He forced himself into a swift, silent crouch, melting back into the darkness of the creek bed. He didn't stop until he saw the single, unwavering light in the window of Clara's cabin. He burst through the door, gasping for air, and collapsed into a chair. He pulled the two ledgers from his shirt and slapped them on the table. "I got them," he panted. "I got them both." Clara and Cody rushed to his side. Clara picked up the red ledger first, her hands trembling as Silas pointed to the entry. She read the words, "He calls it a permanent solution," she whispered, her voice filled with venom. "The black one has the finances," Silas said, pushing it toward her. 4 ranches, the Abernathy place, the Millers, the Ortegas, and Frank's. It's all here. Dates, forged debt amounts, the pittance he paid for the land. They had it. The proof. The weapon. "What now?" Silas asked. "We take this to the U.S. Marshal in Prescott?" Clara shook her head, her eyes flashing with a new, dangerous light. "No, that would take weeks. Pullman would hear we were gone and destroy any trail. By the time a marshal gets here, the witnesses will be scared into silence and we'll be hunted down. We have 7 days until he forecloses. We're not going to run. We're going to end this. Here, in Redemption Gulch." "How?" Silas asked, bewildered. "Potter is his man. The whole town is terrified of him." "Fear is a fire," Clara said, her gaze distant and intense. "All it needs is a spark, and people are more afraid of the gallows than they are of Bart Pullman. We're not going to accuse him of murder, not yet. We're going to accuse him of something they can all understand, something they've all feared. Land theft." Her plan was simple, direct, and incredibly risky. The notice Pullman had served gave them the perfect stage. In 6 days, on the morning the foreclosure was due, Pullman would expect her to come begging, or to be packing her belongings. Instead, she would demand a public hearing. The next 6 days were a blur of clandestine activity. Silas rode out under the cover of darkness, not to Prescott, but to the 3 other families named in the ledger. The Millers and Ortegas had moved only as far as the next county, working as hired hands, their dreams shattered. The Abernathy's son was working in a mine 50 miles south. Silas showed them the entries in the ledger, the proof of the fraud that had ruined them. He didn't ask them to fight. He just told them that Clara Mae Thompson, Frank Hayes' widow, was making a stand on Saturday in front of the saloon. He asked them to be there, to listen. Back at the ranch, Clara did something just as important. She began to talk. She rode into town for supplies and spoke to Mrs. Gable at the general store, letting slip about the fraudulent loan. She spoke to the blacksmith about the impossible interest rate. She didn't shout accusations, she sowed seeds of doubt, letting the injustice of a pregnant widow being thrown off her land percolate through the town's conscience. She was no longer a pitiable victim. She was a woman preparing for a fight. The morning of the reckoning arrived, bright and clear. The entire town seemed to be holding its breath. By 10 o'clock, a crowd had gathered. Instead, he saw her walking down the center of the street. She was not alone. Silas Cole walked beside her, his head held high, his battered face now a symbol of defiance. Behind them walked little Cody, holding his father's hand, and behind them, a sight that made Pullman's eyes narrow. The Miller family, the Ortega brothers, and young Tom Abernathy. The ghosts of his past had come back to haunt him. Clara stopped before the saloon steps, the black ledger in her hands. "Mr. Pullman," she called out, her voice ringing with clarity and strength, "you served me a foreclosure notice on a fraudulent debt. I am here to demand you retract it." Pullman laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Demand? You're in no position to demand anything, Mrs. Thompson. The law is the law." "Then let's talk about the law," Clara said, her voice rising for the whole town to hear. "Let's talk about a man who uses the law to steal land. A man who plants his own cattle on his neighbor's property and then accuses them of being rustlers." A shocked murmur went through the crowd. This was more than just a foreclosure dispute. This was a direct accusation of the highest crime in the territory. "That's a slanderous lie," Calloway, the lawyer, squeaked. "You have no proof." "Oh, but I do," Clara said, holding up the black ledger. "I have Mr. Pullman's own private account book, a detailed record of his thefts. Would you like me to read from it? Let's start with the Abernathy place. August 12th. Forged debt, $150. Price paid for 200 acres and water rights, $20. Tom Abernathy stepped forward. "That's true. My pa told me. He said Pullman trapped him." Pullman's face was turning a mottled red. "This is nonsense. A fabrication." "Is it?" Silas's voice boomed, taking the ledger from Clara. "What about the Miller homestead? A forged note for a broken wagon wheel, price paid for their quarter section, $30, and a threat of a noose." Mr. Miller, a gaunt man with haunted eyes, shouted, "He's telling the truth. We saw them. His men driving the cattle onto our land in the dead of night." The crowd was stirring now, the murmurs growing into angry shouts. They were looking at Pullman not with fear, but with dawning fury. They were seeing the architect of their own quiet desperation. "Sheriff, arrest this man for slander," Pullman roared, pointing a trembling finger at Silas. Sheriff Potter took a hesitant step forward, his hand on his pistol, but he stopped. He was looking at the faces in the crowd, the Millers, the Ortegas, the blacksmith, the shopkeeper, and he saw that the tide had turned. The fear that had held the town in thrall had finally broken. Clara played her final card. She looked directly at the sheriff.
It has some very interesting entries.
One in particular from October. It details a plan to arrange a permanent solution for a man who wouldn't sell his land. It even mentions you, Sheriff. It says you agreed to be cooperative in ruling my husband's death an accident. Every ounce of color drained from Sheriff Potter's face. He looked from the damning red book in Clara's hand to the murderous rage in Pullman's eyes, and then to the sea of angry, determined faces of the townspeople. He was trapped. His loyalty to Pullman meant being an accessory to murder. His loyalty to the law meant arresting the man who owned him. He made the only choice a cornered rat can make. He chose himself. His gun hand didn't move towards Silas. It stayed on his hip as he took a slow step back, away from Pullman. "Bart," he said, his voice shaking, "you're on your own." The dam broke. The crowd surged forward, their voices a roar of pent-up anger and reclaimed courage. Pullman, for the first time in his life, looked afraid. His empire, built on fear and paper, was collapsing around him. He turned to run into the saloon, but the Ortega brothers blocked his path. He was surrounded. His power had vanished in the space of 5 minutes. The story of Clara, Silas, and Cody is a powerful reminder that true strength isn't about the power you wield over others, but the courage you find within yourself. It shows us that one person's brave decision, no matter how small it seems, can ignite a revolution of hope and inspire an entire community to reclaim its soul. They built a new life from the ashes of deceit and loss, proving that family is not just about who you're related to, but who you stand for when it matters most. If this story of courage, resilience, and unexpected justice moved you, please help us share more tales of the human spirit that deserve to be told. Click that like button to let us know it resonated, share this video with someone who needs a story of hope, and be sure to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell so you never miss another unforgettable drama from the pages of history. Thank you for watching.